and foremost thing, the best thing that you can possibly do in this current moment and continue it for the rest of your life is educate yourself. Continue to learn, analyze in a critical way the information that you have been given from everywhere from family orthodoxies to newspapers to TV to schooling, because a lot of that stuff is just internalized, and we need to actually unlearn some of this stuff that has been embedded and indoctrinated from our culture if we are to actually free ourselves and be free-thinking, sovereign people as we are, and be yourself unapologetically, once you come to understand that.
Even the idea of these destruction of businesses, the people who are upset about that don't even understand what it means to destroy capitalism.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you guys.
Yep.
You're welcome.
So just know we're actually live now.
Okay.
So Scott, you're live.
All right.
Okay, you want to do your same intro or what do you
No. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to panel 2 of Voices from the Front Line. We have with us today Mackenzie Wilson, Keon Bliss, and Sonia Lewis.
Yes.
Ms. Lewis, I would like to start with you. You've been working on these issues for a number of years, and it's my understanding that you were one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. As you look at from the time that you and your colleagues began the journey that you're on, and today, how is the policing and the encounters with the police that you're dealing with every day and every night at this moment different than when you all started this movement?
Thank you for that question. I'm one of the former lead members of BLM, not one of the founders, but with that being said, there has been an escalation. There has been a huge shift to militarization. There has been a condemning and criminalization of Black bodies that is more blatant from law enforcement in this area and across the country. I don't think it was as blatant 8 years ago when Trayvon Martin was murdered. But as these incidences continue to happen and folks continue to take to the streets, continue to show up at city council meetings and board of supervisors and challenge all of those peoples who support and are a part of the power structure, I think that they have intentionally gotten more forceful with the people in a way to corral and control the people.
Keon, your program, the organization that you're affiliated with, you all are out there in these demonstrations. Take us, the vantage point that we see on the nightly news or many times in social media is a vantage point from behind the police lines, projecting forward at the people involved in the demonstrations and the marches. Take us on the other side of that. What is it that we're not seeing?
So I think a lot of what folks aren't seeing at home, thanks to the largely centralized and consolidated media that operates here in the city and county, is that these protests, which I hesitate even to call them protests, more like uprisings, is that they are entirely organic. They are emotionally raw, and they've largely been leaderless from the actions that I have seen since Friday night. These are people that are rightfully outraged, justifiably disillusioned, and overall just ready to tear the current system down, because the system that we live in that prioritizes property and profit above all else has continuously, literally from the founding of this nation, continued to devalue them and outright refuse to recognize their basic humanity. And people, like as was said by my comrades here in the previous panel, it was, this isn't just about George Floyd. This isn't just about Stephon Clark. This isn't just about the thousands and countless Black lives that are doing it. It's a culmination. George Floyd is with a spark that continues to relight a dried up brush fire, wildfire that continues to smolder and burn because we as a society here in Sacramento and across the United States continues to shy away and refuse to have the deep conversation of what kind of nation are we and what are our real priorities. And for a lot of folks that have been taking to the streets over the last week, the priorities that they see are by our city and county leaders is property and profit above all else. The economy is the single most important thing to the Sacramento City Council and the Sacramento Board of Supervisors and the Sacramento County Executive's offices. And the police, who they rightfully direct a lot of their anger to, is merely the wall between that. They are the enforcers, they are the protectors, the hired goons of this current system of corporate rule that exists here in Sacramento and across the United States. And until they decide that they actually want to change the goal of the system, the priorities of the system, they actually focus it on human beings, human rights, human well-being, as opposed to just property and profit above all else, they're going to continue to see us out in the street. And another thing that I would add, and I don't want to take up too much time on it, is that these demonstrations, as emotionally raw as they have been overwhelmingly peaceful. There has not been any acts of violence during the daytime and no real destruction of property, which destruction of property to me is not actual violence. It has always been a response to police violence when they try to snatch us out of the crowd, when they're standing in front of us with full-on body armor from head to toe and armed with no fewer than 4 different weapons on each police officer. And then they hit us over the head for simply holding space and demanding access to our institutions, to our property that is paid for with our taxpayer money. That's when people rightfully start to lash out and target the institutions and the buildings and the property that is the source of their oppression and injustice.
So let me follow up with a question to you about, you said that you don't consider the destruction of property to be violence. So I know a young man African-American man who owns a barbershop on J and 25th. And his whole life savings is in that barbershop. He might differ with you based on the destruction to his barbershop about that was not violence toward him because he's done it all on his own. He's essentially learned a skill and built his own economics and provides opportunity for others. Is it okay? I understand your construct of the system, but for those who are trying to actually engage in the cooperative economics that we talked about off camera earlier, are they just kind of collateral damage in that, and that's just kind of the price that has to be paid? Because they actually don't embody the problem, at least as I understand you define it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to a larger extent, they are collateral damage, and it's important to recognize that property can always be rebuilt. There is no end to the businesses that get their windows smashed up or their products stolen out of there. Like the vast majority of businesses, especially here in Sacramento in the downtown region where the protests have been centered are well insured. And not only are they well insured, but their owners, many of whom have to be extremely affluent in order to afford the property cost here in downtown, are very well connected. They have an entire community and network of contacts that they can depend upon to support them in their time, like when they any kind of crisis or disaster happens. And the idea that the smashed windows or stolen property is remotely comparable to the violence that is inflicted upon black bodies, black minds, is a farce. It's absurd. Property can be replaced at any point. You can't replace a black person's life. You can't replace a person's sight when they are shot in the face with rubber bullets, as has happened in Sacramento County. The damage and the harm to black bodies is real, and that stays with people oftentimes for the rest of their lives. The property damage is temporary, but it's oftentimes used as a distraction, this focus in by the narrative, those in power, to focus in on the damage to property, because in the United States, property is first and foremost above all, and human life and well-being, human rights and well-being comes second to that.
Yeah, America was formed on the basis of property, property rights.
The Constitution itself is a property rights document.
So, Mackenzie, I'm going to do something unfair to you, okay? I don't know what you self-identify as.
They, them. Thank you.
Okay. They, them. Or ethnically.
Very white, really
Okay.
white, extra
right.
Caucasian.
Extra Caucasian. Okay, well, welcome.
Thank you.
This particular moment, uprising, to use the correct term, the uprising that's going on in the country and across the world, what is shocking to someone from my generation, even though we had a few non-black participants during the civil rights era and the freedom rides and things like that, the larger diversity that's been seen, particularly of young white people participating in uprisings across the country and in places around the world where, frankly, seeing a black person is like extremely unusual, is unusual to me, okay? And being a cynic, I'm always thinking about the what's in it for me. Why are you participating? and not asking you to speak for, even though, not asking you to speak for every white person in the world that's participating, but you know, often black people are asked to represent all the black people in the world.
Say that.
That are participating in anything. So I'm going to put it on you.
Yeah, come on.
And ask you, why are you here?
Me personally, I really appreciated Dr. Ellis's analysis that there are 4 types of whiteness. You have the racists, you have the apologists, you have the allies, and you have the abolitionists. I don't want to be a self-proclaimed abolitionist. I'm going to look at my folks and be like, yeah, I'm an abolitionist. I'm here understanding that a lot of these problems have to do with racism, sexism, the patriarchy, homophobia, private property. All of these institutions are rooted in white supremacy, and that they all need to be dismantled. It's not something that we can reform away. It's not something that we can band-aid away. I want to say that I got the privilege, though, to grow up in a world where they told us that we broke bread with Native Americans and Martin Luther King's dream came true. And one day there was a shock to a lot of us that realized, nah, that isn't the truth. That my black and brown neighbors don't have the same opportunities and privileges that we have. So when you're seeing these people flock to the front, it's because there's a certain level of education and understanding and conscious awakening to what's happening. People who were just an ally overnight, after being shot and tear gassed, became abolitionists. People who were apologists are now sliding into that
Slow
ally.
down for just a second,
Yeah.
because this is something that I haven't heard before. So tell us what you've witnessed or experienced on the ground that has caused kind of this awakening or this consciousness that may not have been there before?
Well, we've been seeing it for years, right? I mean, Black Lives Matter was established under President Obama, you know, so you have to see, like, you've had 10 years, you've had a decade of people starting to have this larger conversation. Just in the last week, have I watched law enforcement officers, I mean, and the cameras can't tell how far back this room is, but this is where the police line is, and that wall back there are peaceful protesters. And how there's law enforcement officers particularly pointing out Black leaders, pointing out medics, pointing out organizers, for them to intentionally shoot in the face.
Mm-hmm. What?
That is what we are seeing.
Yep.
That's what's happening on the other side when those cameras are behind and the media isn't showing you what's happening, is that they are purposefully targeting those voices that need to be heard so that they can't be heard anymore. Mm-hmm. On your first panel, you brought up this leaderless movement, and how far can a leaderless movement get? Very far, because they can't take the leader out.
Right.
You know? And so when I'm seeing these people who know that they're peaceful, they're saying out loud, that's all over social media, why were they shooting us? We're peaceful. Why were they doing this? We're peaceful. Why are they? George Floyd doesn't deserve this. You know, when people are asking these questions, but still law enforcement's only response to our outrage, our righteous outrage, is more abuse and violence and the culture that is policing, right? These cops, the mayor, the board of supervisors say that they've had no reports of these things. Well, of course, they're not going to snitch on each other. They're not going to tell. They don't even have to report how many people they shot that night.
Right.
They don't even have to wear body cameras.
They don't?
The city does. The sheriff's department refuses to. And he got on a press conference that said he put in a proposal 2 years ago to the Board of Supervisors. Black Lives Matter has been demanding the sheriff's department hold body cams for years, and he refuses to do so. Yes. These public officials and local officials can all day long get in front of these news cameras right now because they're trying to save face. But this conversation, and it only escalated this far, people are becoming radical overnight because this conversation has been had for 400 years by Black people. White people haven't listened for the last 400 years, and we're starting to, because guess what? We see it now. It's not just something that we hear about. It's something that's being filmed. We watched a man beg for his life for 8 minutes before he died. That in and itself is radicalizing.
Sonia, when Black Lives Matter first came out, or first kind of came on the scene, and I'm speaking as just a member of the public, it didn't come across that Black Lives Matter wanted any abolitionists, didn't really want any white participation. I think it's confusing for a lot of members of the public. Can you explain what the view is on participation, not just of white people, but of other people who are not Black in participating in this movement?
Right. So rightfully so, Black folks have bore the brunt of, on the shoulders of, blood, sweat, and tears of building this country, right? There is no way that I can say that we don't need space to ourselves and by ourselves for healing's sake, for planning's sake, for organizing's sake. But we also recognize where the power structure lies. And sometimes going to the Board of Supervisors or to City Hall and hearing a message from an angry Black woman, because I'm going to be boxed as an angry Black woman, even though it's justifiable anger and rage that has permeated in my body and DNA from my mother to my grandmother to her mother, back to the slaves that were, right? That shift in DNA. When we think about that, we know that we have to rely on people who will be able to deliver the message. And unfortunately, it's not a angry Black woman, which this movement is highly led by Black women. And so when you think about, I want to go back to that also to add in and try to connect some dots here, the issue of property. America being the biggest looter on this continent, throughout the world, has stolen Africa's most prized commodities, black bodies, right? So they've looted, they've stolen, and now you want to point the fingers at peaceful protesters and say, this isn't right. Every responsible business owner should have insurance. That's what that's for. I don't want to say that I'm a looter, but I'm most definitely an abolitionist. I am not a reformist. And I think that Black Lives Matter and other organizations that are very much grassroots, that are very much Black-centered, recognize that we have to have some kind of presentation in a way for the delivery of our message to be received in order for change to come. Mackenzie also mentioned, in response to the folks on the front lines, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey, our leaders were targeted. So there's a target that comes with this work. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thankful when I have comrades and accomplices in the streets that say, let me get my hands dirty because your hands have gotten dirty for too long.
Wow. Keon, I want to ask you, to talk about Stephon Clark's death and his murder and the aftermath of that brought forth this huge outpouring of, at the time, what was reported as consciousness raising. And we were going to get into the neighborhoods and we were going to reach these young people and we were going to essentially pay attention to these communities that have been left out of prosperity in all of its forms. And not just economic, healthcare,
socially,
spiritual, you name it. And the demonstrations, the uprisings, kind of pull into relief that a lot of people in the community aren't satisfied. Mm. What happened between the aftermath of Stephon Clark's death and today, or I should say, what didn't happen that was promised, but yet undelivered?
Yeah.
Well, the first and foremost promise that we were ever given, by our founders and our elected leaders are constantly trying to remind us is that, we have equal justice under the law, and Stephon Clark was ultimately denied that. And after his murder, we saw our county district attorney, Anne-Marie Schubert, refuse to charge the officers. Not only refuse to charge the officers, but actually assassinate the character of Stephon Clark, just to add insult to injury. And what happened when we rightfully were outraged at that response and took to the streets not in predominantly Black neighborhoods like Oak Park or Del Paso Heights or Meadowview, but in the East Sacramento, in the
Don't
Fab
you mean
40s.
formerly Black neighborhood?
Say that.
Yes.
Formerly.
Yes.
Formerly Black neighborhoods that are continuing to be gentrified. Yes. When we marched through the affluent white neighborhoods in the Fab 40s, we had 3 different California police departments, Sac PD, Sacramento Sheriffs, and California Highway Patrol joined together in riot gear and march literally 1-to-1 with every person that was out there and chased us through those neighborhoods. Ultimately pushing us away from the places that we were trying to leave, to exit, to go home, and then kettled 84 people who were just peacefully and rightfully demanding justice from a system that has routinely denied it to them from day one of the United States. Nothing's changed since then. Nobody's been held accountable from Sacramento PD, Sacramento Sheriffs, or California Highway Patrol. In fact, they've only been adding insult to injury. We have seen no less than 5 more deaths since Stephon Clark's murder. One of an 18-year-old kid, Daryl Richards, who was having a mental health crisis. And Sacramento PD called in SWAT over one phone call and hunted a young black boy for up to 5 hours through the Curtis Park neighborhood, and then ultimately shot him. And for some reason, we don't have full-on footage for that, so it didn't raise to the level of outrage that Stephon Clark's murder did. But it still happened. The black community felt it. We always feel it, every single time. And city and county leaders, Mayor Steinberg and the city council, the county board of supervisors, have done absolutely nothing to change the status quo from that.
Now, I've got to interrupt you for a second because you say that, and not to pick on the city of Sacramento, and Mackenzie, if you want to get in on this, I don't care who gets in on this, but there is a greater representation of people of color, certainly not enough women, no gender balance, but of people of color on the City Council of Sacramento than arguably in its history. So what does that, if we accept as supposition everything that Keon just said, what does that say? Because, you know, the panacea has been you elect people, right?
I think that it says that we can't dismantle white supremacy from within white supremacist institutions. I think that's exactly what it says. I think that no matter how many people we can put up and turn into puppets and whitewash and all of this, that no matter what.
So you're calling those...
Oh, no. I'm saying that those institutions and those policies that they come up with, when they say that we're going to go into these communities and we're going to try and do these things, it's all done with the intention and the motive of economic, right? Of economic stimulus. It's not about how to save communities, how to help communities, and even how to bridge these gaps. It's literally how do we go in and address these things with an economic incentive, and then it never gets changed. Right. Mm-hmm. Because it is coming from within the master's house.
Hold on, I just heard two mm-hms right here. Okay, give me some what that mm-hmm means.
So that mm-hmm is going back, think about the last panel, the crumbs, right? So what came out of Stephon's murder was these pop-ups. What came out was a throw at a few dollars for 2 community leaders that were already established and connected with the city. And so there wasn't an opportunity for new leadership to come in and new programs to be developed and a new fresh idea to be presented to the city. They work with, by selection only, individuals who they have vetted because they want people to fit into said status quo, because if they don't fit in said status quo, then they're not giving up the dollars. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, it does cost money to run programs and heal our community, heal the wounds that have been inflicted on our community. So the is the white establishment is what it is in a way that is extremely powerful and very multifaceted to get through, because there's so many loopholes, there's so many corners and curves like a puzzle that you'll get to a dead end and then you got to try to find your way back out of it.
Mm-hmm. And your
Yeah. I mean, what Sonia just said, I mean, those marginal token changes that our elected leaders made weren't honest or straightforward changes. They were concessions to basically placate the majority of public that was looking for something, anything, in a system that has largely and utterly denied them any kind of real representation or resources that they can build from. And when we talk about, city council is, more diverse than maybe, say, the county board of supervisors, which has no black people on it. Just like Barack Obama, those are largely tokens. Right. And if you look, it's not all rested within city council or county board of supervisors. If you look at the appointed positions of power that they make, is overwhelmingly white. I think the statistic is over 80% of Sacramento County's leadership is still white. And when you look across the United States of all elected offices, more than 71% of all elected office holders are white, and 65% of them are white men. Yeah. So even to this day, in 2020, we still live within a country that has largely excluded the most vulnerable and exploited and oppressed populations in this country from even just, not just access to the political participation, but representation within it.
Absolutely.
Can I just throw in there one thing? A beautiful example is AB 392, right? This was something that had to be taken all the way to the state level.
I was going to say
Tell
the
us
same
what
thing.
AB 392.
It's a change in the use of force policy. It's no longer okay to just shoot somebody because
the Weber bill.
Yes. So AB 392 had to be taken all the way up to the state because local electeds weren't going to do anything about the policies. Now this law has changed on the statewide level, but every single one of these members on the city council refused to vote and update their use of force policy because they want to save face because they love their boys in blue.
Right.
You know, they don't want
Hold
to
on.
vote. Yeah.
Wait a minute. Okay. So you're saying that this is a state law that has been enacted, but that there
That
is
created
a requirement.
because of Stephon Clark.
Right. But there is a requirement that local bodies, city councils,
Update
boards,
their use of force policies
you're
to
saying-
reflect the language.
You're saying that the city of Sacramento has affirmatively,
Refused.
and the county board of supervisors
Refused. And let me just add that after our fed up and frustration when we saw no inaction, when we saw that they would be inactive and not willing to work with the people, we said bump the local officials. We said bump the city, bump the county. We're going to find some allies at the State House because we know that the state will trump both county and city. And so we met with some people. We sat down at the table and we said that this is what's happening in your districts. These are the people that you represent. Here are your constituents who are saying that this is a problem. Help us craft some laws. So not just the change of use of force law, but then you also had the Stephon Clark law, even though watered down, makes law enforcement say, I can't do business as usual. And so if we continue to go to the state, and even I'm even at a point where we might need to visit some federal, legislation to have, but we also know that there's been a centuries, decades of trying to address a lynching law. So really and truly, where are we in this wanting to update laws to reflect the citizenship of our country? Thomas Jefferson said that every 20 years, you should look at your laws and update them to meet the citizens that you serve. And I would call foul because the use of force policy for Sacramento Police Department was created in 1876, and that just changed in 2019.
And so as of this moment, that use of force policy still has not been updated?
Hasn't been updated. If there's a state policy.
No, I understand, but that action still has not
And
been
it has been brought to their attention many times.
And what has been the official statement back to you all?
None.
None. They don't even,
They just ignore us.
literally. Like Black Lives Matter and so many other organizers and organizations across the community have been like demanding this, like begging for this for years.
Yeah.
And they have largely just ignored us, dismissed us, or outright laughed at us, or just, tried
got
to
up
make
and
it
left the
harder for
room.
us to actually speak up and voice at city council. In fact, one of the responses city council did in response to Stephon Clark was to change their public comment period. Not just once, not just twice, but at least 3 times to prevent speakers, predominantly black speakers, from actually participating within the city council process. And we can see where their priorities continue to lie with the current proposed budget for 2020 and 2021, where Sacramento City's police budget is the 3rd most expensive on their budget. Sacramento County's budget to the sheriff's office represents more than 40% of the county budget, and they're right now talking about making additional cuts during the middle of the pandemic, particularly to health services, community-based health services, and mental health services, which even by our own elected officials' words has been an epidemic crisis for years now. So it's like when we talk about that nothing's really changed and that where the priorities lie, it's still largely to this protect, not just property, but also to the protectors of property, the people that make them feel comfortable and make them feel safe where they're at, because they've never actually made any serious systemic changes. They've only made concessions that allow them to maintain their status on power as well as their comfort with it.
even the oversight commission they gave
Right.
has no teeth.
Has
right?
no
It's all
power.
just a public save face ploy. This is like it's a game to them,
Yeah.
and that's a chant of ours. You know, like what you think this is a joke? You think this is a game? We've been in these spaces and in these places demanding these things for 10 years. I've been doing this side by side by half the folks in this room for many years. I've watched Darrell Steinberg roll his eyeballs. Yeah. We're over it. That's why this is happening. Because I guarantee you, if we've hit city council, if we've hit board of supervisors, if we've hit governors, guess what every other state that is now on fire has done?
Right. And they're using some of the same language that's coming out of those new laws that are coming from, California. The fact of the matter is, not only are they trying to save face when it comes to who we're willing to work with and represent. We as the people, the have-nots, I call the society we live in the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots are now banding together, and that's Black, that's brown, that's poor, that's unhoused, that's those suffering from mental health issues, that's those who don't have adequate medical care, right? Those who are disenfranchised in the school system. And they're coming together and they're saying our intersections are bringing us together. And we see you, we see each other, and that's the strength of the people. And so when the strength of the people show up, I'm not mad as an organizer of a Black-led, Black-centered organization when folks who now recognize the pain and struggle of being Black because their intersection is something familiar to them, right? The Poor People's Campaign has said for years, when poor folks and Black folks get together, it's going to be a problem. And it's going to be a problem. We're not going anywhere in that regard. It's a fight. It's a marathon, and we have to make sure that we are changing out, folks who can show up in leadership positions. I believe that everyone in this moment can be a leader. So don't let the target be on individuals' backs or let the burden of the work be on a few. One of my colleagues in community, Asante, says all the time, many hands make for light work.
All right. And I think that that's the word. We're going to leave it right there. Let's thank our second panel, folks. A victim and survivor's perspective. And we have with us this afternoon Dr. Christy Higgins and Christy Ketchum. Dr. Higgins, I'd like to start with you. What is the psychological impact of state-sanctioned violence on an individual?
That's a big question, but I will say it is big, huge, broad. Like much of what we've already heard our panelists talk about in terms of maybe some of their own personal reactions are what one can expect, right? When we think broadly about trauma, when we think about post-traumatic stress, people are usually familiar with that term. We can think about that, but apply it specifically as it relates to race and racialized stress and trauma. So it's going to show up in terms of rage, justified, right? Anger, disconnection at times, a sense of numbness. At some points, I know for me, not being able to sleep, some sense of confusion, hard to kind of focus, feeling triggered very easily by situations and circumstances that might not normally be upsetting for us. I mean, the range is huge, in particular, even if we just think about the psychological impact. But then there's the physical, there's the spiritual, there's the whole gamut of our whole body, our whole experience that is triggered by everything that's happening right now.
Ms. Ketchum, is it similar to just, and I don't want to diminish this, but to interpersonal violence that we're used to experiencing?
To me, I think it's a collection of it all. So exactly what she just spoke about, it is a constant. So it's not only the trauma that we see on TV and through the media, it is also the trauma that is happening at home. As this pandemic has continued, we know that there has been an increase of domestic violence, child abuse cases in this time. But what we also know is that Black women also take the brunt of that. So we know that over half of the 336 Black women have been killed since January 1st of this year. half of them have been done during this pandemic. So what we know is that not only is it the trauma, not only is it the triggers, but it is the increase of murder, particularly of Black women and vulnerable communities that are affected during this time. And I would also want to say is that we're in this specific pandemic right now, but we've been dealing with this pandemic over and over again. This has been a cycle of violence and trauma that we have to endure on a daily and regular basis. I think that it has its highs and its lows, but the time off, the time that we don't have to think about our safety and to think about, how we're affected or what we need to do to make sure to keep ourselves safe, that is an ongoing, regular thing that we have to think about it. And I think about that as particularly as a Black woman. Right.
And when you think about the health-related conditions, both mental and physical, that disproportionately affect the African American community, and that's everything from diabetes, particularly among Black women, heart disease, things like that. And you look at the conditions that we are facing at this moment with COVID-19 and coming into this March, what do you consider to be the biggest things on the list that people need to essentially monitor themselves for in order to protect themselves? Because whether you are part of an uprising or you are in your home, this entire moment has, from what you're both saying, is taking a psychological toll on all of us. But that manifests itself in the physical. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give?
The best advice that I could share, and I've helped to create that, is having a strong circle of friends and people around you. It's 8 years old, but I started the Sacramento Sister Circle, and it is particularly for Black women over the age of 18. And it's basically online, but we also meet monthly, and we also create a real sense of sisterhood. I think unless you have that support system, unless you have those that truly care and support you and are in solidarity with you, this is a lot to manage. Mm-hmm. And even with the supports that we have and the connections that we have to each other, we still continuously are still dealing with the trauma, the depression, the microaggressions, but having a space and having people that you can have these conversations with that know exactly what you're going through, that you don't have to explain yourself, and that can even recognize when something is going on with each other. We don't often talk about all the things that are going on with us because we appear nice. We talked earlier about black doesn't crack, but in the inside, Flo often brings this up, is like, is some stuff going on with us, right? And so really being able to look within more of what's going on with each other, being able to support each other's in those needs without people having to say like, hey, I need help, like I'm drowning, like we're drowning often. So let's just make sure that we're there for each other and be in support of each other, and then also working together so that we can build that foundation for each other.
It almost sounds like the advice you're giving embodies the name of what you, Dr. Hagan, are the president of, which is a Black safe space.
Safe Black space.
Safe Black space.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to kind of piggyback on what Christy, my sister here, has talked about in terms of us being able to have a place where we as Black people can have an opportunity to heal, to talk openly and honestly about all the different impacts of the various things that we've been talking about on our lives. That's critical to our ability to maintain and sustain ourselves, to build kind of protective factors, to understand who we truly are as Black folks, that there's this incredible strength and resilience within each of us. And so part of what we do in Safe Black Space is create a container and a place for us to do that work, to do that amongst ourselves in terms of as family, to understand our history a little bit more directly and how it impacts us now, and then to identify ways to take care of ourselves. Mm-hmm. You know, part of, I think your question was, you know, how can we manage all of these different things going on? And so I think community or family or having support is really important. But part of that also means having some sense of self-awareness, right? So being able to check in with yourself and understand what's going on with me. And why am I responding in this way? And who can I reach out to help support me if I need it? And then if I see my brother or my sister struggling, how can I reach out and offer support to them? Because this is a long road we've been on for hundreds of years. Yeah. And so we've got to pull on our capacity to be a village and to support each other, particularly, again, when the master, when the colonizer has his knee on our neck.
You know, when you talk about support and support systems, it's interesting. Many of the protests, uprisings, whatever you want to call them, that have taken place, have all centered around black men. I will tell you that personally, Breonna Taylor gets mentioned less from what I see in news reports or even on social media than Ahmaud Arbery or Mr. Floyd. And I'm curious, likewise, you know, are women, first off, are women really, they're participating in these protests and these marches and these uprisings, but are their voices really being heard? Because there are some who write that they're carrying the brunt of the struggle on their back, but they're not necessarily always on the stage and having their voices heard. Mm-hmm. Any reaction to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Black women particularly have not been heard. We often hear the quote by Malcolm X that we're the most disrespected in this country, and I would say the world. And what I will also say is that while our voices are not being heard, we don't have the luxury of staying home. These are our sons. These are our family members. Black women are the head of households, over 60% in this state of these communities. So we don't get the luxury of saying like, oh, we don't want to do anything. Our liberation and our freedom is tied together. And so that's a very hard and challenging place to be. However, this is the place that we continuously see ourselves in. And I think that there has been strides for us to speak up, and there has been opportunities for just even in the Black Lives Matter movement that was led by 3 black women that are feminists, that identify as queer. You know, there are women that are being uplifted, but again, it's still the far and few in between. When a lot of us, when I think about my friends and my family, they're doing a lot of work. So maybe they're not at the protests, maybe they're not marching, but the work that they're doing for their families, themselves, their communities is ongoing. And not only does that brunt not happen in actual being seen and heard, but it's actually something on our family levels that we're dealing with. How do we make sure that we are creating families and communities that see us and don't invisibilize us, and then also kill us and then be silent about it? That's an ongoing conversations that we're having. And it's very frustrating. I think we get really tired. I feel like the Fannie Lou Hamer quote continuously comes up. I'm sick and tired of being tired. But again, our liberation is tied together. So it's like we have to continuously figure out how we're going to improve in this area, because we're not going anywhere. We don't have the luxury of going anywhere, and we're going to have to fight this out.
Dr. Higgins, Ms. Ketchum referenced a term, intersectionality. And while, you know, trans people, black queer folks have showed up and have participated, and they've shown up for, in particular, black males who've been killed and have been mutilated. There doesn't seem to be reciprocal support. What is it? Why are those voices not being heard, or at least their interests? They're showing up, but their interests are not necessarily being spoken to.
Let me make sure I understand the question.
Well, the thing is that there's this whole question of intersectionality. And in the last panel, one of the panelists spoke to the fact that if you could get folks together and see where their commonalities of interest really are, there's power in that.
Right.
It seems in the minds of some that, in particular, those intersectional interests, and whether they're female interests, whether they're trans interests, and the like, that there's not necessarily, they can contribute, but their issues aren't necessarily heard. And I was wondering if, what's going on in the movement as to the reason that those issues and those individuals aren't being elevated?
So I have multiple things that are coming up. So one response is, I think it's reflective of the larger systemic and societal issues, right? We're replaying what we have learned around the devaluing of other marginalized communities. I think that's part of it. I think there's also this understanding, and for me, to just kind of own my place and position as an African-centered psychologist who's been focused on this work, there's this very narrow view in which I know I find myself focusing, wanting to say, can we please, just for this moment, acknowledge Black bodies and Black racial stress and things that are racialized specifically around Blackness. Knowing that, yeah, we are all these intersecting pieces of our identities that may make us who we are as Black people. Right now, can we focus on, again, the hundreds of years of what the original enslavement, the taking away of our true genius and connection with Ma'at, with our divine kind of sense of being? Like, can we just focus on that?
And the reason for just focusing on that, what's the power in that?
Well, for me, at some level, I want us all to recognize that we are African people. Like when we go back far enough and trace into our understandings of human civilization, that we're all African people, and yet we are socialized and raised with this narrative that what is African is wrong, right, or bad, or inhuman, or uncivilized. And so for me, there's this awareness that we need to have to recognize that, and to not be ashamed, embarrassed, or unapologetic about that. And so that's a place from which I stand, and again, no disrespect to, again, all the pieces of our multiple identities and the ways in which we've unfolded as people. But we have not done a good enough job, I believe, of focusing on these particular dynamics for our people.
Sketchin, you have a response to that?
No.
No? Okay, well, what I wanted to ask you about is this, is that when you look at the psychological impact that's led to the current state of affairs, that hopelessness, that sense of anger and pain that has fueled people in terms of expressing themselves at the moment. There comes a moment where it is that you have to do something with it. Any thoughts about tools that we might start to think about in terms of how it is that beyond the uprisings themselves, you talked about people, you know, that you have family members that are behind the scenes that are doing things. What sorts of things can we do to put ourselves in a state where it is that, let's suppose that we're not going to be out on the front lines, but we still want to have a role to play? How can we do that, and at the same time, by doing that, actually engage in some self-healing moments and activities ourselves?
Someone mentioned on the first panel about studying. I think it's very critical at this time for us to be educated about who we are, those that came before us in our history. I think that gives all of us a sense of empowerment and understanding of that it's just not us, like we come from a continuum, and continuing to do the work of our ancestors, and hopefully we're doing it better. Sometimes it doesn't look so much like that, right? But the studying, I think, is very important, and I think that's something that's really been lacking as of late, is that there's a big, huge disconnect in us understanding and knowing our history and where we come from, and also the lessons. What were the lessons that we got out of that? I think second of all is that we need to pull in our resources. Where are the buildings that we have bought to, where are the places and the spaces that we can go to even gather? Like, we really need to figure out how we're pulling our resources and thinking about how we can work collaboratively to support and sustain each other. I think that there has been more of a movement around, you know, buying black and doing those types of things, but really doing that so that we can sustain ourselves in real ways, where we can keep our community. And then the other thing in Sacramento is, where is the black community, right? We're all over the place. We're all over Sacramento. We don't necessarily even have that space that we can actually say, oh, this is our community. You said earlier, formally as, you know, the black community, like really
I was
thinking
about to say, what about Oak Park?
Oak Park is definitely not the black community. My great-grandfather came from Georgia, actually came from Georgia under duress in the 1940s and bought 2 homes in Oak Park. It is unfortunate, but those communities are no longer ours. And it has a lot to do with all the things that have been mentioned before, redlining and all those different things, even predatory lending and all those things. So really, I think foundationally, like, we have to get back to like the things that, like my great-grandparents came, like really pulling our money together, really being able to buy property and to be able to sustain that property. I think we've all started to understand that we need to start growing our own food and we need to be healthy, and our immune health. I think that's something that's really important, is that we really need to take care of ourselves. So it's great that we look good on the outside, but what's happening on the inside, we really need to take some inventory around that. And a lot of it, in my opinion, doesn't have anything to do with the medical field. It's about like herbs and vitamins and like really like being in touch with what are the things that are going to make us better. And then the other thing that I'll continue to go back to is community, like really building that support system that we have to support and sustain each other, that really checks in with each other and has some love and support for each other. That is real. And we know what is not real, right? And I think we participate in what's not real too often, but like really being able to support each other and have some love and grace for each other. I think we're the hardest on each other. And so figuring out how we can have compassion and grace, how we can really work with each other. I think those are some of the tools that really sustain and help me when I think about how I want to be and what I want for my community. Yeah, let's just.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Higgins, when I hear Ms. Ketchum talk about, you know, some of those sustaining activities, it makes me realize that I didn't ask the fundamental question, which is, share with us, when you said you wanted for a moment to focus on sort of what is the condition of black people, when you said that, what I should have said was, well, tell us, what are the things that we most suffer from as an outgrowth of our circumstance in this nation?
Right. Well, again, that's another huge question, but I'll do my best.
You know what?
Right?
You got doctor in front of your name.
Right?
You got big shoulders.
So that outcome is some of what, I mean, we've heard from our community and our panelists so far what we are seeing, right? And the responses of the rage, the disruption, the revolution, right? That's being televised right now. And we also see the ways in which we are, in terms of disparities, at the lowest, like when we think of priority list of all the different markers, right? Educational system, criminal justice system, the healthcare system, like we're behind, or we're in the negative outcomes related to those things. And so those are some of the things that we're seeing. We're also at some level experiencing, of course, this idea of white supremacy and the lies around that, and how we've all kind of been drinking the same water.
And how does that pour out of us? I mean, I mean, is it increased alcoholism? Is it increased?
Right. So we're going to see the way that society treats us, and then we might internalize that, right, in terms of internalized racism or oppression. And so then we begin to hurt and harm our own selves. So it might, yes, show up in terms of alcohol or substance abuse in some way. It can show up in violence in terms of our relationships. It can turn up in terms of depression, right, and self-harm, hurting ourselves in ways that may or may not be intentional. It can show up in terms of black on black violence, right? But again, we want to understand the root causes and not just do all the finger pointing that sometimes happens as a result of our history and where we've come.
It's interesting, when you think about all that black people have faced in this country, and then you bring that forward to the victims and survivors of the violence that led to the moment we're in today.
Right.
I think about those families, the brother of Stephon Clark, his family, the son who we recently saw of George Floyd, and the family members of Breonna Taylor, her mother. And what are they going to be dealing with as they try to process those tragedies and to make some sense of them?
Right. So ongoing grief, right? Kind of this unresolved grieving of the loss of the lives of their loved ones, which was undeserved, right? And I think, there's more to it than that, but I also want to make sure that I give voice to the fact that we are all experiencing that level of grief, right? Particularly if you are a black person and a person of color and you're witnessing. I don't know about you, but every time the video comes up, again, whether it's the coverage of Stephon Clark from a few years ago or George Floyd right now, right? You just open up a Facebook page or news story and they're showing the imagery. And so we're constantly re-traumatizing again, even if it's not my brother, it's not my son, it could be, or maybe it has been. And so there's this level of which we are each carrying that. And the direct family members, they have an even larger weight to carry, right? Because they're dealing with that loss, and then all in front of the public eye, and then constant reminders about the death or the murders of their loved ones. So this is intense. And as a nation, as a world, as a globe right now, we are all working through our reactions to what is so very obvious, and has been, at least for many of us, and for others, maybe they're waking up a little bit.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Because I work specifically with crime survivors and their families. And one thing that I think we forget after kind of all the coverage goes away and the funeral services is that these families have to they have to work with police to encourage them and to demand for them to do investigations on their family members. They have to go through court cases. A lot of parents that their sons were killed, they're having to, their trials and their cases have been suspended in this pandemic. They're being re-triggered every time they see someone else. This happened to another family member. It's a constant trigger. It also is very hurtful because there is a lot of resources that particularly black families do not get.
Like what?
So victims compensation, a lot of these families they don't receive these services. And every state has millions of dollars for victims compensation and VOCA, which is victims of crime money. They do not receive the resources at all in regards to what they need in order to survive some of these tragedies. You know, I think overwhelmingly, I think it's difficult, of course, and you're definitely grieving about your family members, but then to also not receive the support that you're supposed to receive is very overwhelming.
Well, let me just interject. You've raised something that I've never considered before, which is that if a loved one of mine was killed because of police violence, and I'm seeking redress or justice through the system, I'm processing that death and all that goes with it that both of you so well described, and I'm having to access the exact same system that I'm in an adversary to at the same time. I can't imagine what that burden must feel like.
And that's often and not only when it's a crime committed by the police, also community violence. So if they deem you as someone that was gang related, or if you're not a desirable in like this example of a victim, which I don't know what example that is, right? They cannot even give you anything for your loved ones. A lot of families have not received a dime to help them when there has been a crime committed against one of their loved ones, and haven't received any of the state, local state funds that they're supposed to have. And it's very disheartening because there's a lot of resources and money out there. And even the way that they approach the families, like when this tragedy happens, I think the police actually gives them this information. It's like, here's this packet of information and you fill this out. And then you have to navigate that along with all the other things that are going on. And then they deny folks if you're not cooperating with the police. So there's this ongoing, and it's criminalizing in itself the way in which victims of crimes and crime survivors have to deal with this whole system. It's horrific. And the fact that a lot of particularly black families have to deal with this is something that my organization and I work with all the time.
It also raises the question, Dr. Higgins, that I wonder how many healthcare services, particularly in terms of mental health care support, those families are receiving at the same time. Because if they can't access the compensation system on their own, it stands to reason that they might not be able to access the other pieces of support that most of us would assume would be there.
Right. So a couple things. I appreciate what Christy has brought up, because it's so critical, and how people again are re-traumatized by the system, that intersections, if you will, of the systemic kind of violence, right, that can be created towards. And racism, right. It's just institutionalized and built into what we're talking about. But the other couple things I want to mention is we need black providers and healthcare folks and people who are able and willing and aware and conscious and awake to be here to serve people when they do show up or need services. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, number one, can I get in to get services? And then when I get in, am I going to see somebody that looks like me, that understands me, that gets me? Or are they not going to understand and then, again, re-traumatized because they're going to not get it or ask questions that are totally ill-aligned, right?
There's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah, that, or
get over yourself.
Victimizing the victim, right? So, I mean, there's been studies done in California, kind of statewide, around cross-racial ethnic groups in terms of accessing mental health services. And black folks, 70% of the time said, I feel like services that I would receive would be different if I were not black, right? If I were white, Asian, Latino. They said 50% of the time I would not recommend that someone of my race seek therapy or mental health services. That's because some of the services we're getting are not appropriate, culturally competent, and so that's the other push I want to urge our young folks, or our old folks even, like, get involved, learn, educate yourself, and find ways to be involved, whether it's at a official, clinical therapeutic level, or just, again, ways that we can do that person to person, because there's no one that's going to save us but ourselves.
And I think that will be the final word. Let's thank our panel.
Three, two,
And so now our final panel of the day, policy strategy and future agenda. And joining us are Asantewaa and Kula Koenig. So let's bring us home. I want to start with, many view the current issues as the result of failed leadership. Asantewaa, the mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg, recently touted progress. What's your take on Sacramento's progress over the years?
What progress?
Progress on the whole issue of police violence, about attention to the underserved, attention to communities of color, attention to the needs of young black and brown men in neighborhoods that have been traditionally disadvantaged. Is that a long enough list?
Yes, and I would say that there hasn't been any progress that the mayor wasn't able to use as a photo opportunity or as a way to tout progress without any actual progress being made. From what I understand, there's been lots of money collected and spent on research to house folks during this crisis, and right now, National Guards are living in those trailers and folks remain unhoused. But I believe that there was lots of news coverage about Cal Expo and all these new trailers that were in their parking lot that was supposed to house these folks. And I think that Sacramento city government is very skilled, right, at touting that we're doing so much better, that we're doing so much more, while in fact they're continuing to line their own pockets.
And Kula, your view?
I think this question always leads to people to start talking about the city of Sacramento. And as somebody who's lived in the unincorporated Sacramento County off and on since I was 12, live in the same neighborhood. The county has a $4.4 billion budget. I think there's like 65% of that is just on law enforcement. The county is allowed to get away with so much because they don't even pretend to care. They don't even pretend to care. I was astonished that recently, when I found out, just because I was on a call, that the county had $180 million in COVID-19 funding that they had to spend by December 2020, and I was like, I'm not hearing anything about this. Whereas the city of Sacramento, I was like, well, the mayor put out this memo, yes, it's performatory, all that, but I was like, the mayor has a memo, people know it, no one knows what's happening in the county. I called a county supervisor, and the answer I received was, ask Nav Gill, who's a county executive. That's like me calling my representative and they saying, well, ask the president, right? Whatever. So then I talked to a chief of staff, and I was told the county is not going to have a performance like the city. That was the quote, we're not gonna have a performance like the city has. We have already started to spend this money. It was approved on April 21st, and it is, we don't have that, we have other things to worry about. We're in a pandemic right now, and we can't have this show like the city. So Sacramento County, they have Health and Human Services, and they're allowed to get away with so much shit, and I'm so tired of it. So yeah, leadership all around, but Sacramento County, they need to be called out.
You know, there's a thought that the county is more conservative than the city is. But from you both, it sounds like you have the same complaints regardless of which part of the region you're talking about in terms of government performance.
Right.
Where's, in the year 2000, just, you know, to take a step back, the city of Sacramento, which is the largest subdivision of the county, was called the most diverse city in America. Most diverse city in America. Are the policies and programs of this region, and so I want to make it broader than just the city, take into account Ms. Koenig's statement about the county, reflective of the demographics of its community that it serves? Sadhwan?
No. No, it's not. I would say I haven't been in Sacramento very long, but I have been in healthcare for a very long time. And just as an example, the folks that work in our hospitals do not reflect the folks that we're taking care of. And it absolutely shows in the kind of care that folks are getting. So,
Tell us more about that.
well, because we all have internal biases, right? We understand that the healthcare system, just like policing, was bred out of white supremacist ideas and theory, right? So the fact that my patient who's in the bed is an other, right? Let's say they may be addicted, or they may be Black, or they may be trans, or they may be whatever it is, wherever their intersections are, whatever it is that they're dealing with. From what I see, is a lot of the times healthcare providers who don't have any of those shared experiences, who don't come from those same communities that we work in, their patients are then other to them, and they're treated in that same way. And then also when we talk about like our young boys in Sacramento city school districts are being suspended at egregious rates. So diversity, yeah, sure, maybe there's a lot of different ethnicities, but for me that doesn't equal diversity.
Ms. Koenig,
Can I just say diversity doesn't equal progress?
well, you actually went to the question I was about to ask you, which is that even if you take the subdivisions of this region, whether it's the city of Rancho Cordova, the city of Elk Grove, the city of Sacramento, the county of Sacramento, even West Sacramento and Woodland and the surrounding areas, most of the elected officials would define themselves as progressive, many of them actually liberal. And if what you're saying about their performance is true, it is not that they can blame this on the other. Well, if we were only in power, if only these people from another party weren't there, we would be performing. There's no one outside of themselves, by and large, with an outlier here and there, that aren't a member of the same party. California is a one-party state. So what does that say about the state of our political system? And then the second piece of the question is, if it's a political system that purports itself to be aligned with the interests of the underserved, what do we do next?
So for the longest time, I was actually a decline to state, because I felt like the Democratic Party didn't fight for us, and they still don't. And I saw that example when Kimberly Ellis was running to represent the state of California as the lead of the Democratic Party. There's a whole history, I won't go there, but it's really upsets me. We like to say, my organization, Black Women Organized Political Action, we say all skin folk and kinfolk, right? You mentioned in the earlier panel, you asked how come, in the city of Sacramento, we've got 3 Black men, and I would like to, they are mouthpieces, they are status quo people, and you talk about what we do. I've been sitting listening to the first 3 panels, and I kept thinking, we want to dismantle a system. What does it look like to dismantle it, and what do we replace it with? So then I kept thinking we have to dismantle a capitalist system, because all of this stuff is based on the need for profit. And so somebody has to be a winner and a loser, right? And that is how we got here. That is why you also have patriarchy, right? Sexism. Who can be at the quote unquote low level so that you can be at the top? That is what capitalism does. And so I'm like, have we tried to have a socialist system? Can we do that? What does that look like? But the candidate that even talked about that was eschewed because it just wouldn't happen. So anyways, long-winded, but if we're really gonna talk about change, then we really have to dismantle the foundations of the system, because it doesn't matter who's in power.
You agree with that, Sadawa?
Yes, I do. And I actually have to be frank to say is I don't believe that our current political system is effective, right? And any engagement that myself or my organization do is simply another mechanism to dismantle it, right? So I don't want to speak as if I believe that these mechanisms that are in place are going to help us or change things. I don't actually believe that, but I think that we can go about supporting policies or laws, right, that are going to provide the people some relief, right? Like, for instance, we're thinking about the Crisis Act that puts funds into community organizations that replace first responder systems that have neglected us, right? That have harmed us, murdered us, right? So I don't think that our current government is going to fix it, right? We have to dismantle white supremacy along with the government that white supremacy built.
To follow up on that, you know, one of the biggest conversations that is happening right now among the activist community is about a conversation about defunding the police. Well, let's start with first principles. What does defunding the police really mean? Because when many people hear this, including myself, I'm like, okay, so there is no one, you know, how do you, if some, we'll say it the way it typically happens, if some man is physically violent to his wife, who responds then? So help me and the people that are watching us understand, and you please jump in, Ms. Koenig, what this means and how it would work. Because defunding the police sounds like that there is nothing that takes its place.
I'm happy to weigh in. I started my career in Sacramento politics was 2007, and it was working on an initiative called Yes to Youth, right? We wanted to just carve out a little bit of funding for youth development programs in the city, right? And that was met with fierce opposition from the police unions, from fire, right? And we even were like, well, fine, maybe we'll put a little bit for intervention programs, so at least probation, there's something, right? So you guys can come along with us. They wouldn't do it, okay? Fast forward, we had Measure G, right? Which said, we don't even trust y'all. We want like this specific set aside, right? Versus what we were trying to do is put something like a quarter-cent sales tax, which I thought, brilliant, have an actual set aside. That still didn't happen. So when we're talking about, I'll speak for myself, when I talk about defunding police, what I'm talking about is actually investing more. I want to see it to be, the last time I looked at the little county pie, I want it to be 60% community investment, right? Which is what it's not that way now. It's like 60%, you know, public safety, right? Why does it need to be that much? Why? Why are you over policing certain streets? Why? It costs, and I did the math a long time ago, we put up billboards, it was how much it costs to house a kid in juvenile detention for 1 year. I think it was something like $61,000, probably more now, versus what it would take to have a youth program that we were just trying to get funding for. So that's what I'm talking about, is priorities when I say defund.
Okay, so you're not saying
I'm not saying that there's no police. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that maybe they're 15% of the budget.
Okay.
Go figure. Wow.
Sadawa, you have a response?
So when we talk about defund the police, I think we first have to talk about what the police are, right? Especially policing in America, the history goes back to slave patrols, right? Like folks that went out to go catch folks' property, meaning my body, right? And bringing it back to the individual that owned them, right? That is the history of our current police system. So if I were at home and someone said, hey, give me 50% of your income and I'll keep you safe, that would be called extortion, right? So this is happening on a county, state, national level. They're saying, give us half of your money and we'll keep you safe. And then folks argue when we say, hey, why don't we really look at crime? Why don't we look at the reason why folks are addicted and fund the prevention, right? We go, oh, no, we gotta be safe. We gotta be safe. But folks that are poor, folks that are people of color, folks that have different intersections, we know the police do not keep us safe. The police job is to return us back to our owners. Prison industrial complex is a money-making machine, right? So not only are our paychecks being extorted, but then our bodies are being returned back to property. And then folks say, well, what are we gonna do without the police? Be free, right? And yes, crimes happen, people are hurt, those things need to be responded to. But when folks talk about what are we gonna do without the police, like, why are we starting with, What happens if someone beats his wife? Or what happens if someone gets raped? But if you look at the numbers of folks that are in prison, these are not the crimes that are being committed. People are in prison for being poor, for being addicted, for not having resources, for being mentally ill, right? So yes, defund the police, put more money into mental health, put more money into youth, give people homes. It literally costs less money to house someone who's unhoused than it does to incarcerate them.
So, okay. So, accepting all that you just said, would there be any sort of law enforcement that existed in this brave new world that you both are describing? Actually, Ms. Koenig said yes. What say you?
I say we need to redefine safety, right? Because when we talk about safety, especially in this context, it means keeping my black ass away from their stuff, right? So when we talk about safety, meaning can I walk down the street, right? Am I gonna be shot in the head if I reach for a cell phone in my pocket, right? So first, I think we have to redefine safety and who's being kept safe. So I think we can exist without police. I think we can. I don't think that police have always been something that has been in existence. But what we have to do is, one, focus on how do we prevent folks from committing crimes? What is crime, right? Redefine safety, and then put it in the hands of folks who have shared experiences, community patrols, accountability, transformative justice processes. I will hope that in the near future we could be brave and think outside of the constructs that our masters gave us, right? Because we can do it. There are lots of folks creating programs, creating institutions. My organization created Mental Health First. We literally hop in a car and go out and assist folks who are in the midst of a mental health crisis who would otherwise might be met by police, when we know that 80% of folks that are murdered by police are in the midst of a mental health crisis. Problem, solution, let's fix it. We don't have to continue to depend on the systems that oppress us.
Okay, which sets us up for, would love to hear from both of you, and either of you can start, specific policy recommendations on if we were in front of the Board of Supervisors, City Council in Sacramento, or any of the surrounding cities, if everybody had to adopt the same uniform sets of changes, what would you ask for?
Go ahead.
I would say support AB 2054.
Which is what?
It's the Crisis Act, and that's the one that takes state dollars and puts it in the hands of community organizations in order to build our own first responder systems. I would say support AB 2054, recall Scott Jones.
I think he's
defund the police.
Okay, yeah. All right.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is, so all of the different laws that we can have, but there's a systemic issue, right? So I've been learning about the racial equity impact analyses, right? So which is whenever you have a policy that is going to be proposed, or when you're deciding how to budget, right? You are literally doing an analysis of how it's going to impact folks racially and in an equitable manner, right? How this policy is going to happen. So similar to an environmental impact report that they do,
Yeah,
right?
it's
Right.
like in any real estate development
Right.
has to put out its environmental impacts on the community.
Exactly. So what I would like is for Sacramento County and all of the 7 cities in the county to commit to, in 2021, implementing a racial impact analysis and using, there's many tools out there. Race Forward has the tool that they put out there. I believe that when we can do something like that, we start to get at a lot of the layers and the ailments that we're already facing. And then the other thing I will add is being an activist, you realize that the few of us show up at meetings and we scream and we shout and we get tired and they wait us out. It's been like a perpetual thing. and we get tired. And we've been talking about how do we have a consistent presence, right? And a way to hold people accountable. So Flo does the voter guide, and we're always like thinking, hey, how did this person vote, or what are they? Let's do some research on them. And I'd had in my mind for a long time, I wanted to have a coalition of folks to go out to meetings, and you're dedicated. You go into this meeting your day, your time. And so during quarantine, I finally put that together where I'm like, it's gonna be a system where folks are gonna pick where they're gonna go, and there's a simple form they're gonna report back, and I'm gonna compile it every couple of weeks. And I'm going to share that and keep that as a record and it's gonna be looked at from a social justice lens. Because then if you can have that, we're holding them accountable, and then we're also doing these racial impact analyses, I think then we can get at a lot of the other things that we've been talking about.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you both. And thanks to our audience today for this forum. There's been a lot of people showing a lot of passion and a lot of interest in the issues that we've talked about today. This set of panels was to better inform all of you in our community. So not only can we make better decisions, but we can be a part of creating those decisions. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Scott Syfax, and let's hope that this is the beginning and that there's more yet to come. Good night.